Want to welcome everybody here. I think we're ready to go. Yeah. I was looking forward to today's presentation. I will let you know that this is not a prepared speech. This is the first time I've had an opportunity to talk to a group that would be interested in these particular stories. And that's mostly because you have Andre here who incorporates Hiawatha, and she's brought that eastern energy of the Iroquois here in this part of the country, but in a brand new and fascinating way that many of you have experienced already and have found to be a good thing, an enlightening experience here. But the story begins a long time ago. Up in the Great Lakes area, up in the New York area, and up into Canada. And at that time, the people were warring. They were fighting. They were killing each other. The people's hearts were on the ground because they were always burying somebody that they loved, either a father, a brother, a child. And at that time, the Creator looked down, and he was trying to find a way that he could change what had happened because the people had forgotten the original instructions. And so at this time, the most famous of the people that participated in this healing of the people from that time is a gentleman called Tiganawida. Now his name is considered sacred, and so it's not spoken by the Iroquois people. But only for the sake of this understanding that you would know who he is, we call him the Peacemaker. And through the Christian influence, the Peacemaker has been turned into a very Christ-like, Jesus-type figure. Another person that participated in this was a Mohawk chieftain named Hiawatha, Antoine. He has 4 or 5 different spellings, as each nation spells his name and pronounces it a different way. And this is the spirit that Andre works with. And the story about him is also well known. In many traditions, he's considered a cannibal. First off, he starts out as a Onondaga chieftain. But he and the head chief of the Onondaga don't get along because he's a sorcerer. So Hiawatha leaves that area and finds a home among the Mohawk, where he becomes a chief, and he marries the Mohawk chief's daughter. They have 3 beautiful children, and in the process of the wars and fighting with this sorcerer that's head of the Onondaga, he loses all of his family. This creates so much despair in his mind that he becomes a cannibal and lives by himself out in the forest. And this is where the Peacemaker finds him and performs a healing on him to straighten his mind. And then he becomes a spokesperson for the Peacemaker. For the Peacemaker speaks with what they call a crooked tongue. But in that time it meant a stutter. It was hard to understand him. And many of us interpret that the language that he spoke was unfamiliar to the people. And so Hiawatha became the spokesperson for the Peacemaker. And Hiawatha was eloquent. How he could tell the story of freedom and the story of peace. And he was just so filled with this that he served very well in that capacity of helping to teach the people the message that the Peacemaker was bringing forth. But in all the writings that I could find stateside, there was barely the mention of a third person. And this third person was a woman. And in the stories, they said, well, she had a camp out on the edge of the forest where all the warriors would come, and the warriors would stay at her lodge. And that was about all they would say about her. And I got really curious. Who is this woman? You know, I mean, was she bigger and hairier than the guys? Or what was the deal here? Why was she there? Why was she alone? So in the stories, I discovered that the Wendake, that the Hurons up at Wendake still had a lot of their story. And from there, they connected me into other clan mothers that helped me with the story and helped fill in many of the missing pieces. So the story of the Great Peace Woman is the one that I want to share with you today. Her story actually begins in the beginning of the creation time. And this time is a time when Sky Woman, who comes from a world that is above ours, is thrown out of Sky World. And as she falls toward our earth at that time was nothing but water. And the water animals saw her falling, and they were fearful for her, for they were afraid that if she should fall into the water, that she would drown, and that would be bad for our earth. So the big birds flew up, 2 swans flew up, and they caught her in her wings and let her sit on their backs as they flew around circling the earth. But it wasn't very long before she got pretty heavy, and the birds realized they couldn't do this indefinitely. Pretty soon some other birds would come and relieve them. But the animals on the earth held a council. At that time it was just water animals. The water animals got together and said, what can we do? How can we solve this problem? So they decided that they would get some of the soil that fell out of Sky World when Sky Woman fell out, and they would put it on the back of the great big snapping turtle. So animal after animal would try to go down and get some of the soil. But each time it was such a long ways down that the animal's lifeless body would come back up to the surface. And it got to where none of the animals wanted to try, because it was obvious it was a suicide trip. Till finally Mother Muskrat said, I'll do it. So Mother Muskrat took her turn, and she swam, and she swam, and she swam, and she swam, till finally she got a little bit of soil on her paw, and then she came back up. But it was such a long ways up that her lifeless body now came to the surface. But the animals swam out to help her, and they discovered she'd gotten some soil. So they took the soil from her tiny little paw and put it on the back of a turtle. And there it began to grow. It grew, and it grew, and it grew. Finally, there was enough soil on the back of the turtle that they could set Sky Woman down on it. So now Sky Woman, wherever she walked, this earth began to grow some more. Wherever she moved, till finally she took the soil and she threw it to the 4 directions, and then the earth sprang up farther than what she could see. Now Sky Woman was pregnant when she was thrown out of Sky World. And according to the story, that was why the chief threw her out, is because he did not understand that the child that she carried was created from his breath. And he thought, filled with jealousy and anxiety, that it was because she had been unfaithful to him. And so within 3 days, this child was born, and she named a little girl Fat-Faced Lynx, Jigon Sassy. And she grew very quickly, and her and her mother would go all over the earth, and they would plant some of the plants that had been in her burden basket when she'd been thrown out of Sky World. And so as they went around planting things and naming some of the animals that they were beginning to see on the face of the earth, the mother and the daughter grew very, very close. They were the only ones that each other had. They were each other's world. Till finally one day, the young woman had grown, and Sky Woman could see that she was getting of that age where she would want to marry. But you know what? Sky Woman didn't like any of these earth beings. None of them were good enough for her daughter. She wanted a sky being for her daughter. So she called her daughter to her and said, Lynx, I want you to promise me that you will never marry without getting my permission first. Well, Lynx thought that was a strange request. Who was she going to marry? There was no other sky people here. But she agreed. Yes, Mom, that's what I'll do. Well, North Wind had been watching this young girl as she grew, and he was so enamored with her. He wanted to marry her. He loved her. So he had a problem, though, because since he didn't know how to court a human being. He didn't really know how to present himself. So he decided he would go as a squirrel. So he fills his cheek full of nuts, goes over to her, lays them at her feet and says, "Lynx, will you marry me?" Well, now Lynx, she wants to be married. She wants children of her own. But this is a squirrel. I have to ask my mother first. So she runs and she asks Sky Woman. Of course, Sky Woman says, "No way, you're not going to marry this one." So she comes back with the news, "No, I can't marry you." So now North Wind thinks, well, what else can I do? That didn't work. So this time he's going to be a fox. So he shape-shifts and now he's a fox. That big bushy tail with the white tip and the big pointy ears and the whiskers. Oh, he looks marvelous. He goes up to Lynx and he says, "Lynx, will you marry me?" And Lynx looks at him. Oh, beautiful red coat. He looks so sly and wise. I have to ask my mother first. So now she runs and she asks Sky Woman, and Sky Woman says, "No way can this be." So she comes back and delivers the sad news. "No, I can't marry you, Fox. My mother says so." So now North Wind goes away. What am I going to do? Finally, out of complete desperation, North Wind decides to go as himself. He dresses his long black hair, puts the feathers in, puts on his finest buckskins, puts on his paint. Now he goes to see Lynx. As he comes into the clearing where Lynx is, Lynx sees him. Lynx forgets all about asking Mother anything. She invites him home to her lodge. And in those times, he said that he would be back about dark. So he left and he came back just about dark carrying certain items. And that night he laid Lynx down, and on one side he put an arrow that didn't have a flint on it. And on the other side he put an arrow with a flint on it. And then at her head he laid a lynx skin, only it was blue. And at her feet he laid the precious Oneida rose, the Cherokee rose, the wild rose, as all the nations, even the Shoshone, claim it. So laid the wild rose there at her feet. And then in the morning he gathered them up and he left. And the mother spoke to Lynx and said, "Now I see good things are going to happen for you, my daughter." And over the next few months they watched as Lynx got bigger and bigger and bigger as she was with child. Now the story that has come down to us because of the missionary tells of only 2 children that were born that day. They tell how Sapling, the good twin, was very thoughtful and considerate and came to earth in the good way. But the other one, Flint, was impatient and came through the hole and made a hole in the side of her with that sharp ridge that he had on his head, which is why he's called Flint, and killed his mother. What they don't tell you is there were 2 others that were born, twin girls that were born. The one was named Oini Jigonsase, and the other one was named Sweet Blossom, and I don't know the Indian words for that one. But these 4 became the 4 directions. Each one of them took a part of creation and became creators. So now that we look at the creation, we see that the animals helped create the earth as they brought the soil up and put it on the turtle. We see that Sky Woman helped create the earth. Lynx, the first lynx, helped create the earth. Now we've got the 4 of the 4 directions that helped create the earth. And so the earth is being created with a multiple of people helping. And you can see that this is telling us that we have a part. We all participated in creating the present reality that we're living in. Also, when we take a look at the story of how North Wind came to Lynx to ask for 3 times, he pretends to be something he's not. It's only when he comes in his truth that she falls in love with him. And this is the same thing that we do in many different ways. We will put forth what we think people want to see or what people want to hear from us. But when we stand in our truth, impossible things will happen. And this is one of the teachings that comes later with the Peacemaker. So now when Lynx dies, she becomes the Mother Earth. Her spirit goes into the earth, and now the earth lives. There is now a spirit there to communicate with, and she literally becomes the living earth. This also is one of the teachings of Native Americans all over, all indigenous peoples, that the earth is a living being. And this is the Iroquois explanation of how she became a living being. Now, for the purpose of our story, I want to move forward in time to the time when they're warring. And the Creator has prepared the Peacemaker and Heianwentha for the mission that they've agreed to do. But the third person, this woman that lived out in the forest that very little is known about, at that time was being born. And what they tell about her birth is that she was born with a caul over her face. Now this is a membrane. And this membrane shows that she's got exceptional psychic gifts. So at about the age, what we would say age 2, very, very young, she is down-fended. Now down-fended means that she was given to the elders, that she was set apart. She was taken away from the village, given to a couple of elders to be raised. These would teach her everything that she would know. She would learn medicine ways. She would learn spiritual ways. She would learn talking to the trees, talking to the plants, learning what their properties, what their gifts were, what they offered mankind. She would learn all about the spiritual world. And she would learn about their ways of diplomacy, of making friends, of bringing friends in. And so at a very young age, she was given to the elders. Now, from the information that I have received personally, these elders were 2 very old people. They lived in a cave. And in this cave is where they taught things. And from morning till night, everything was a teaching. Everything was a teaching. In fact, as this young girl grew, she didn't get playtime with blocks and video games. Everything was a teaching, to where every teaching became second nature. It was just something she knew, something she understood, something that she comprehended. And so talking to the trees or gathering things was just part of who she was. And this continued for some time. When she was about 8 years old, they brought in another young woman. This girl was 4 years old. Her name was Tatiana. Tatiana was also being down-fended by the people, and being taught by these elders now. She stayed both girls stayed with these elders until they matured, until the rites of passage of becoming of age. For most girls, this was around the age of 12. And at that time, Tatiana was returned to her people. But for our young girl named Jaconsese, it was much later in life. She was almost what we would consider the age of 18 before she was returned to her people. And that is why in some cultures they believed that there was a virgin cult among the Iroquois where you had to be 18, and at 18 you could then become a Jaconsese. But this whole thing centered around the fact that Jaconsese never married. Jaconsese never had children. And so the information I received, it was because she couldn't have children. That's why she matured much later than the other girl. And so as she finally reached this age where they said, well, she's grown up, she knows everything she needs to know, it's time to return her to the people. And so she was brought back to the people. Now remember, at this time, she hasn't been around whatever's been going on in the village. She's been totally sheltered from all of that. And her life has been just one peaceful little coexistence with everything being familiar and everything being part of her friends. As she's brought back to the people, there is a little ceremony that brings her back into the people, and she's introduced to the people. But immediately, people from all over are hearing that she's finally returned to the people. So people start coming to talk to her. And as they talk to her, they discover this great wisdom that she has. Wisdom that is way beyond even the training that she's been given. And so it comes that the people of all nations start coming to her to have her decide their disputes. If two hunters shoot the same deer, they bring it to her to decide how to divide it up. Well, she asked questions and discovered that one was a bachelor and the other one had a large family to feed. So she offered the suggestion that the way to solve this problem is each take half the deer. But the one with the large family gets this half, and the one that was by himself was to share his with all of the orphans and all of the widows that were in the village. In that way it would be fair and equitable. And so it was agreed upon. So each time a decision needed to be made, she found a fair and equitable way to resolve the conflicts that were going on. So that by the time the peacemaker sees her in his vision quest and knows that he must search out this woman of renown, she has already become a judge, like a judge in this capacity, to as many as 14 other nations. By this time, she was already receiving treaty belts from these other nations and had established a tenable peace. In her village, she was on both the warpath north and south, east and west. It was on this path that the warriors would come through on their way to conduct war. As they came through, they would war all the way there and all the way back. And so Jikonsase reasoned that the way to resolve this was to make treaties with these 14 nations that were coming through there. So she called them forth when they would come through, and the treaty agreement was such that these warriors would have free passage through the land that she had say over, in return for not fighting in her cornfields and in her orchards and in the garden patches. And as the warriors came through, they could find lodging in her lodge where they would be fed, they would have safety, and they would find lodging for the night. So one by one she forged these treaties with these 14 nations, so that now she was in an area of peace. And so it continued. It was this way for some time, because it is said that Jikonsase was probably in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, by the time the peacemaker sought her out. And at this time, she'd become weary, because it seemed like every time the people came with a problem to solve, it was the same problem she just solved last week. Maybe different people, but same problem. And she was getting weary of being the problem solver. She wanted the people to do their own thinking, to do their own reasoning, but she didn't know how to do that. So, as she is contemplating this, and all of this is happening around her, for around her many nations are fighting and warring and killing each other. Many villages are starving to death because they're afraid to even leave their stockaded villages. And all this chaos is going around her, yet in her village, there's peace. There's safety. And one night in a dream, she was visited, and she was told that there was a young man that would be coming to the village, and she should watch for him. And not too long after that, the Peacemaker arrived at her village. And he was an amazing energy. Among the Iroquois, they have two energies. They have a Yuki, which is always good. This is sky energy. Sky energy is always good. Always good. Always thinks and does what is right. That's the sapling energy. The other energy is Octan. Now, Octan energy is not always thinking clearly, just sort of doing things and letting things happen, whatever happens afterwards. But they also recognize the energy that people carry. We call it an aura. Among them, they call it orenda. Now, as this young man comes to the village, his orenda is so bright. He carries an energy that is so bright and electric. It's not shocking, not like that. But I mean, the presence is so there that it's undeniable. And so when he's met at the edge of the village, he's brought in and he's taken directly to her lodge. And as he walks into the lodge, he looks at this woman that is the head clan mother here. And he says, "Jikonsase, Jikonsase." This is to say, new face. For they say that Jikonsase was the reincarnated lynx that had been his mother in the cosmic. And the Peacemaker is the reincarnated sapling or raueño of the four directions. Then later on, as the story goes on, there is a wicked sorcerer who is believed to be the incarnation of Tawiskaru or Flint, the one who had killed the mother. So as he says this, Jikonsase, Jikonsase. This has created a lot of confusion for anthropologists and ethnographers who do not accept the idea of reincarnation, because they think Jikonsase is also his biological mother in that particular lifetime, and they get it all mixed up. But the explanation that was given to me is Jikonsase, Jikonsase meant that he recognized the cosmic spirit mother that was now embodied in the body of the Jikonsase. And so she asks him, what is his purpose? And he says, my purpose is to bring peace to the people, to stop this warring, to stop the witchcraft, to stop all the things that are happening and bring the people back to the original instructions. Here she says, well, that's a great idea, but how do you propose to do it? And he says, well, the form that it will take is the longhouse. Now, at that time, the people lived in these long houses. Sometimes 250 people would be living in one house, but it was headed by the matriarch of the family. Now, if you remember back in the creation story, we had Sky Woman, we had Lynx, and these are the matriarchs of the entire Haudenosaunee nations. So the lineage belonged to the woman. Unlike with us, we take the last name of our father in this particular civilization. In that one, the lineage followed the mother. So the children belonged to the mother. So here, now, the Jikonsase, this longhouse thing is a family thing headed by a head clan mother. And it may comprise maybe 250 people, maybe all of her daughters and their families will live in this one longhouse. So when he said it will take the form of a longhouse, this brought pictures and understanding to her immediately. And the actual form of the longhouse, and I wish I had my condolence cane, I wish I'd have brought it, but what it was you had 5 nations. You had the Mohawk, you had the Oneida, you had the Onondaga, you had the Cayuga, and the Seneca. They actually sat like this from the eastern to the western door on the landmass up there in New York. And so the longhouse was to include this particular family situation. Each one of these nations, he was thinking far ahead because he hadn't even approached these nations yet. But each one of these nations would have a fire in a longhouse that would govern all of the nations. She says, that's a good plan. She says, I'll take hold of your plan. I'll embrace your plan. And so at that moment, she became a supporter for the great peace. Supporter for the peacemaker. She went about immediately using all of her connections to help the peacemaker achieve peace. She had among her villages other clan mothers who would perform the same duties that she did in the lodge. Feed the warriors, give them a place to lodge. And now she was going to add to it one more thing. Now they were to exhort peace to all these warriors. When they came, they had to listen what advantages peace would bring to the people. And the advantages were many. So now she has all of her clan mothers teaching peace. She's teaching peace. And the peacemaker makes his first journey into the land of the Mohawk. And the people at this time are so exasperated. They're so tired. They're tired of war. They're tired of starving. They're tired of never being able to do anything but fear for their lives. And the peacemaker comes and he says, Creator didn't intend for you to be fearful. Creator didn't intend for you to war. Creator intended that you'd have peace in your villages, that you would enjoy all the beautiful things that He's created for you. And the Mohawks say, well, you know, this is great, and we hear you're going to bring peace, but you know what? How do we trust you? How do we know that you don't have warriors hiding in the bushes, that as soon as we give up our arms, they won't rush out and they'll massacre us? And the peacemaker says, you people, look at me. I come without any weapons. I come without any warriors. I belong to no nation here, and yet you still don't trust me. And finally, the head chief says, well, tell you what, if you'll climb up this big tall tree that's right next to this 80-foot chasm, and we'll chop it off, and if you survive the fall, then we'll know that the Creator's with you, and then we'll believe what you've got to say. The peacemaker, out of frustration, jumped upon a withered tree that leaned out over this chasm. And here he turned to the people. He said, you people believe a lie. Just like this tree, this withered tree, you believe a lie. You believe that war brings you prosperity. But look at you, you are starving to death. Just like this tree zaps the strength from the earth for absolutely no good reason, because it doesn't produce anything. No leaves, no fruit. He says you believe it brings you safety. Yet every day you bury your loved ones. This is a lie that you believe. And I'm going to ask you to cut this lie out of your life, even if it's the one that you're standing on. And they say at that point, the peacemaker took his own hatchet and he began to hack away at this tree that he was standing on. And he hacked and he hacked, and at that time the clouds came over and the rains began to pour, till finally there was only a little bit of the tree still holding together. At that moment he stood up, and the sun broke through the clouds and shone upon him. And he took a leap and he jumped and broke the tree and fell into the chasm. And of course the people then ran over to look, and they couldn't see him anywhere. The next morning, one of the warriors was walking around the village and saw the fire coming, and walked over and discovered that it was the peacemaker there beside the trail. So all the people came out, and the Mohawk became the first people to accept the Great Peace. But it was not too long after the Mohawk accepted the Great Peace that the Great Peace Woman arrived also. Now, it is said that in Hiawatha's lifetime, he had 3 daughters. These 3 daughters were killed by the great sorcerer. And there is a beautiful little story that goes with that. And that had caused him to become a recluse and like a hermit. But the youngest daughter was the one that he had loved the most, and she came back as a guide to the Jikonsase. She would appear to her in her dreams and let her know the desires of Hiawatha, the desires of the Peacemaker, when it was time for them to have a council. And so this happened one night, and the Jikonsase left her people. They called for Tatsiana to come and take her place. She would now be the one that would govern the Huron clan mothers, be the head clan mothers for those people. And she took what she needed and went to be with the Mohawk people. Here she labored among the Mohawk people. Now there's great pain, and we still see a lot of this even among our indigenous peoples today, because of the atrocities that have happened, the way that this government, I mean, this is probably the best way to relate to what she was trying to do at that time, because they had been fighting and warring. Everybody had buried somebody but they loved. Everybody was hurting inside. Everybody had been crying for revenge. And this was the state of the people, but it's the same state that we have today among our indigenous people, because our government ordered cavalries in that just massacred entire peaceful villages. Arms were taken away from them, and they were massacred. Then after we finally forced them into reservations, we came along, and this government took the little children and warehoused them in boarding schools. And this was done for over 3 generations, where children were taken away from any type of love they knew. They were mistreated, sex abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse. Anything that they would do that was Indian-like was reason for some form of torture and punishment. I lived in Oklahoma at the Seneca, where the Seneca Indian School had been. They had a graveyard filled with little children that never went home. Never went home. Either died out of loneliness or died because somebody killed them and murdered them. Then we had the whole episode where our government and the missionaries brought smallpox blankets into the reservation, and the people would take these, and then they would break out with the pestilence of smallpox, which they had absolutely no resistance to. And many of the people died from that. The missionaries at that time did this on purpose. Why? Because they could not convert the Native Americans from their belief systems. They believed in a loving God that loved their children, and the Indian people were his children. They could not comprehend the Christian God that was always angry because you were always doing something wrong. They could not comprehend the ideology of thou shalt not, because theirs was you shall. You shall. And so the Indians did not convert. And so what the missionaries found is when they got sick with smallpox and were on their deathbed because their medicine man and all the herbal things they knew could not cure them, they would do a deathbed confession. They would gain souls for Jesus in a deathbed confession. Now, not too long after the boarding schools, or during the boarding schools, there was also forced sterilization. And this is something a lot of people don't know anything about. If a woman had a baby in a hospital with Indian Health Services, she came out and never had another child. They did this to thousands and thousands of indigenous women from Alaska clear through the United States. And this is extremely difficult for an indigenous family, simply from the standpoint that the matriarch, the mother, the woman, is the progenitor of the line. She's the progenitor of the people. The people continue through her. She's honored, she's respected because of her ability to bring forth new life and children. And when this was taken away from her, it made it very difficult for her in her role and her place among her people. Now, Indians didn't have 14, 25, or 18 kids. They knew how to use the herbs, and they spaced their children, and they limited how many they had. So it wasn't a case of them overpopulating the place. It was simply the fact that they were giving birth, that they would do this to them. One other thing that they did is they did an adoption program in the 50s and 60s where the little children were taken away from their homes. All of you that are familiar with Native American ways understand the extended family. Children often are raised by their grandparents, not actually the parents. This is traditional from one nation to the other. But under the white way, when a child was being taken care of by the grandparents, they considered that inappropriate, and it gave them cause to go in and take the children away and put them in Indian health, where they would then adopt them to white families. So now this is the situation we have among our indigenous peoples right here, right now. People want to know, why can't they assimilate? Why do they have the problems they have? Why can't they just be like white people? They've never had a time to heal. Since the white man first set foot on this shores, they've never had time to heal. It's been one trauma after the other. And yet still, if any of you know Native American people, they are the gentlest, they are the sweetest, most loving. In spite of this history, they will still hold you in their arms and make you a friend. They're awesome, awesome people. But this is what Jaconsasay was encountering among the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas. This kind of trauma, because this is what they'd been experiencing. Only now she was asking these people to do something that we wouldn't even ask today. She's asking this mother to become the sister of this mother over here, because both had lost a son. Even though traditionally, perhaps it was her son who killed the other one's son. In war, nobody knows who does what. But this was what she was asking. She was asking each one to forgive the other nation. Forgive the people. Recognize that this mother hurts the same way you do. Recognize that this family hurts, misses their child, their loved one, their father, the same way you do. And through this recognition, the women began to see in each other that they were all the same. They were the same family. There really wasn't any difference. The pain they shared was the same. The love that they could share, that would be the same. So Jaconsasay went in among the people, and this was the work that she did, was to teach the people how to forgive, how to recognize the God that was in each one of them, so that they could transcend and get past the anger and the pain and the hurt, and envelop the forgiveness so that the love could come into the people. Now, at the end of this, they have the two nations here and the two nations here that have accepted the great law and are coming into it.